ever catch yourself daydreaming about life after graduation?
Uh-huh.
You know, like cap, throw it in the air, tassel move from one side to the other.
Yeah.
But then, like, bam,
Right.
that thought pops in your head. Hold on a sec. How long is this dissertation actually going to be?
Yeah.
I think it's something that every grad student thinks about.
Oh, yeah.
It can be a little scary.
Definitely.
But the good news is, just by thinking about it now, you're already ahead of the game.
Absolutely.
So today, we are diving into a resource that's going to help us answer this question. It's an article called, How Long is a Dissertation? Average Length and Time Required.
Okay.
Now, I know you're thinking, it can't actually tell us how long to write.
Right.
Every dissertation is different.
It is.
And that's where our expert comes in. They're going to help us figure out why focusing on just the number of pages. It's not really the right way to think about it.
Exactly. It's kind of like, comparing a novel to a scientific research paper. Both of them are writing, but they're completely different, right?
Yeah.
Same with dissertations.
Okay, so it sounds like it's less about how many pages it is and more about the type of research that you're doing.
Exactly. And this article, it breaks down dissertation types into 4 main categories: empirical, non-empirical, theoretical, and case study.
Okay.
Each one is going to be a little bit different in length because of the type of research.
Right.
But before we get into all that, the most important thing to remember is quality over quantity.
Right. You don't want it to just be long.
Exactly.
You want it to be good. Okay, so let's get into these different dissertation types. Some of our listeners are probably like knee-deep in data right now, while others are, reading tons and tons of research.
Right.
So let's start with empirical dissertations.
Okay, so with empirical dissertations, that's where you're doing experiments or analyzing, survey results. Like, you're doing the detective work, right?
Yeah.
You gather all the clues, and then you have to present them clearly and organized.
Right.
And naturally, that means that you'll have to spend more space on the data analysis and convincing everybody that what you found isn't just a coincidence.
Yeah.
Like the article mentions, imagine a psychology study about how mindfulness meditation can affect stress. In college students, that could easily be a long dissertation.
Right, because you have to talk about all the data. You have to talk about each participant.
It adds up.
Yeah, it definitely ends up. So that's empirical dissertations. Now, what about non-empirical?
So non-empirical is more like putting a jigsaw puzzle together, but you're using existing knowledge and research.
Okay.
The article uses the example of analyzing William Wordsworth's poetry.
Okay.
They wouldn't be collecting new data for that.
Right.
They would just be analyzing his existing work and other critiques and the historical context and things like that.
Wow. So even though non-empirical dissertations aren't using data, they still require a lot of work.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so now, for the big question, what about theoretical dissertations?
Theoretical dissertations, that's where you really get to push the boundaries of your field.
Okay.
Like you could be proposing a brand new concept or, maybe taking an existing concept and going even deeper with it.
Okay.
It can get pretty complex.
Yeah, I bet. So I'm guessing with theoretical dissertations, the length really depends on how complex your idea is, right?
Yeah, and how well you can guide your readers through it.
Right, because you have to be able to explain it clearly.
Exactly. It's about being clear and thoughtful, not about being fast.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got our detective work dissertations, we've got our intellectual jigsaw puzzles, and we've got our boundary-pushing thought experiments. That brings us to our last dissertation type, case study. What are those all about?
So for case studies, you're really immersing yourself in one specific thing. Like it could be one event or one situation.
Okay.
The example the article gives is a business student who's studying the success of a local startup.
Oh.
So they would be doing a bunch of interviews and analyzing the company's strategies and seeing how those strategies compare to their competitors.
So you really got to get into the nitty-gritty.
Yeah, it's all about going deep.
It sounds like it could be a dissertation-length documentary.
Right.
Okay, so now that we know about all these different dissertation types, I'm sure our listeners are wondering, how long is this actually going to be?
Right. How long is it really going to be?
So I'll ask you straight up, what's the average dissertation length?
Well, the article gives an average page count of 225 pages.
225.
Yeah.
I think I need to go lie down.
It does sound like a lot, right?
It does. But I guess it's important to remember what we talked about earlier. It's not just about the number of pages.
Exactly.
It's about the quality. And that 225 pages, that's just an average across all the different disciplines. It's like saying the average height of a person is 5'7". Which, like, I guess it is.
Yeah.
But what about basketball players?
Right.
They're going to be a lot taller than that.
For sure.
And I think the same thing kind of applies to dissertations. Your field of study is going to play a role in the length, too.
Exactly.
And, there are certain fields, like the humanities and social sciences. Those dissertations have a bit of a reputation, right?
They do. They do.
They tend to be a bit longer.
Yeah, the article says they're usually between 200 and 400 pages, sometimes even more than that.
Wow.
But it makes sense if you think about it.
Why is that?
Well, if you're doing historical analysis or looking at, complex philosophical arguments, there's just so much research to get through.
Right, it's a lot to cover.
It is.
So those dissertations, it's not just about adding more pages to make it longer. It's that the research itself requires more space.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's humanities and social sciences. What about STEM fields? Like sciences and engineering.
Yeah.
Do they get a break when it comes to length?
They tend to be a little shorter, usually between 100 and 300 pages.
Okay.
But they focus on different things.
Oh.
Yeah, instead of massive literature reviews, they usually focus more on the methodology and the results of their original research.
Right, because if you're doing an experiment, you have to describe everything in detail.
Exactly. So that other people can replicate it.
And you can't leave anything out. Right.
Yeah, you got to be precise.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about the thinkers, and we've talked about the experimenters. What about business and management?
So business and management, their dissertations tend to be between 150 and 250 pages.
Okay.
But it really depends on what they're researching.
Oh, right, of course.
Like global economic trends, that's going to be a lot different than analyzing a marketing campaign.
Right. That makes sense. Now, for something a little different, arts and design.
Yeah, arts and design, their dissertations can be really interesting.
How so?
Well, they're not always just a written document.
Really?
Yeah, sometimes they're more of a multimedia experience.
Wow.
Alongside the written analysis, they'll often present a portfolio of their work, too.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, so it could be paintings or sculptures, digital designs. It's really a way for them to show their thought process.
That's really cool. So it's not just about reaching a certain number of pages. It's about showing how you think and what you've learned.
Exactly.
But there is still a written part, right?
Yeah, there is. That's usually between 100 and 300 pages.
Okay.
And that's where they can connect their art to the research behind it.
Okay, that makes sense. I love that. It's like you're giving people a tour of your brain.
Uh-huh.
Okay, now we still have a few more fields to go. What about medicine and health sciences?
Okay, so medicine and health science dissertations. Get ready for it.
Oh, no.
They're usually between 150 and 350 pages.
Wow, that's a lot of reading.
It is, and that's not even counting any appendices or supplementary material.
Wow. What makes those dissertations so long?
Well, they usually involve things like clinical trials or really in-depth analyses of procedures. And a lot of times they're dealing with ethical considerations too.
Right, and you can't rush those conversations.
Exactly.
Especially not when you're talking about people's health.
Right, exactly.
Okay, now what about our lawyers? What can they expect in terms of length?
Law dissertations. They're typically between 150 and 300 pages.
Okay.
And let me tell you,
That.
they are packed with information.
I bet.
Legal precedents, case analyses. You'll probably need a legal dictionary to get through it.
I might need one just to understand what you just said.
Right?
It sounds like it's really important to be able to, craft a really strong argument in law.
It is, because the law is complex.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and last but not least, education. What do those dissertations look like?
Education dissertations usually fall somewhere in the middle, usually around 150 to 250 pages.
Okay.
They often will blend literature reviews with data analysis and then offer some practical recommendations as well.
That sounds really interesting. It's cool because they get to see how all of this research can actually be applied.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've thrown a lot of numbers out there today, a lot of different page ranges, but I think it's important to take a step back here for a second because you've been on both sides of this process. You've written a dissertation, and you've also guided a lot of students through the process as well. So I want to ask you, how much do these averages really matter? Like at the end of the day?
That's a really good question. And honestly, those averages, they're really just a starting point.
Right.
Think of it like, guideposts on a map. They can be helpful, but they don't tell you everything.
Right.
Because I've seen really incredible dissertations that were short, and I've seen some really long ones that weren't as good.
Okay.
So it's not really about the length. It's about the quality of your research.
Right, and the insights.
Exactly. It's about making sure your work is, insightful and interesting. and that you're contributing something new to your field.
That makes sense. It's not just about, like, checking a box.
Right.
But I do have to ask, what would you say to our listeners who might be feeling a little overwhelmed right now?
I would tell them to remember why they started this whole journey in the first place. It's about, digging into a topic that you're passionate about, something that you're really interested in.
Right. It should be something you enjoy.
Exactly.
Okay. But we also can't forget about the time commitment. This article mentions that a master's dissertation can take like 6 months to a year.
Yeah, that's about right.
And a PhD dissertation, that could take 2 to 4 years.
Or even longer in some cases.
Yeah, that's a really long time.
It is a long time.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, what can our listeners do to make sure they're using their time effectively?
Well, the first thing is to think about the type of research you're doing.
Okay.
Because, like
running experiments in a lab, that's going to look different than historical research.
Exactly. Those are two completely different timelines.
Right. And I'd imagine that having the right resources is important too.
Absolutely. Do you have access to the books and articles you need?
Right.
Or are you constantly running into roadblocks?
And what about feedback from your committee? How important is that for staying on track?
Oh, that's crucial. Having a supportive committee who can give you feedback, it can make a world of difference.
Okay, so it sounds like there are a lot of different factors that can affect the timeline.
Yeah, there are.
But one thing that really stood out to me in this article was how dissertations are starting to change.
Yeah.
Like, they're not just these long, boring papers anymore.
It's true. Things are definitely changing.
Yeah, the article mentioned that some fields are starting to use things like videos and podcasts in their dissertations.
It's becoming a lot more common, and some fields are even experimenting with shorter dissertation formats.
Really?
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think it's partly because of how we consume information now.
That makes sense.
Like, people are used to getting their information in shorter, more digestible formats.
Right.
So it makes sense that dissertations would start to reflect that.
Yeah, it's like, why write a 300-page paper when you could make a website or a documentary?
Exactly.
That's really cool. I love seeing how things are evolving.
Me too.
And I think it's a good reminder that a dissertation doesn't have to fit into this one specific box.
It's really about finding the best way to communicate your research.
Exactly. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what is one key takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
It's interesting. A lot of people, when they start thinking about their dissertation, they get really focused on the length. Like, that's all they can think about.
Yeah, it can be really daunting.
It can be, but I always tell my students, the dissertation, it's a tool. It's a tool for you to explore and discover new things.
I love that.
And yes, it's a big commitment. And yeah, those page counts can be a little intimidating.
They can be.
But it's important not to let that overshadow everything else.
Right.
Don't forget about the excitement of the journey. Embrace the challenge. Be curious.
Those are really good points.
And trust me, the length, it'll sort itself out. Just focus on the research.
That's so important because at the end of the day...
That's what it's all about, right?
Exactly.
Is research.
It's about finding something that you're passionate about, something that you're really interested in.
Right, and then digging deep.
Yes, dig deep. And don't be afraid to ask questions.
And don't be afraid to go down those rabbit holes.
Exactly, because you never know what you're going to find. That's what I love about research.
Me too. It's like every day is a new adventure.
Right.
And that's what makes it so rewarding.
Okay, so to wrap up this deep dive, for our listeners who are about to embark on their dissertation journey, just remember, you got this.
You do.
Don't get too overwhelmed.
Take it one step at a time.
Find a topic that you're passionate about.
Exactly.
And don't forget to enjoy the ride.
The world needs your research.
That's right.
So go out there and make a difference.
And we'll be here to cheer you on every step of the way.